Okay, so picture this. It's London in the 1300s,
Okay.
and there's this place called Bedlam.
Right?
Sounds pretty harmless, right?
Yeah.
Well, hold on to your hats because today we're diving into the wild, sometimes downright unsettling history of asylums in Britain.
Oh.
And it all starts with this place, Bedlam.
You're in for a ride because Bethlem, or as it became infamously known, Bedlam,
Oh, yeah?
really sets the stage for how society viewed and treated mental illness for centuries.
Hmm.
And let me tell you, the word Bedlam itself, meaning chaos and uproar, didn't come from nowhere.
Yeah, I was checking out some old records from the British Online Archives,
Right.
and let's just say Bedlam seems like an understatement.
Wow.
It started as a priory,
Right?
but eventually became this holding place for the mentally ill.
Yeah.
But the part that just blows my mind,
Yeah.
people would actually pay to go there as tourists.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine that, paying money to gawk at people suffering from mental illness like it was some kind of spectacle.
Wow.
It's shocking to us now, but back then, it was considered entertainment.
Seriously, can you imagine being locked up, A&D put on display like that?
Right.
It's just heartbreaking and really makes you think about how far we've come, but also how far we still have to go in terms of understanding and compassion.
It's a stark reminder that what we consider common decency today wasn't always the norm. While Bethlehem was notorious for its horrific conditions and questionable treatments, it sadly reflects a much broader trend in how society approached mental illness for centuries.
Speaking of trends, our main source today is this intense BBC documentary, Mental, A History of the Madhouse.
Okay.
And it dives deep into life inside Hyroyd's Asylum in Yorkshire. What struck me is how these places weren't just buildings, they were like self-sufficient worlds unto themselves.
Hyroids was massive. We're talking its own bakery, railway, farmland, the works.
Wow.
This isolation really played into the idea that these individuals needed to be separated from the rest of society.
And once you were in, it seemed like you were in for good. The documentary uses this word dumped patients.
Right.
Some genuinely ill, others deemed socially inadequate.
Right.
Just left there forgotten. There's this one story about a skilled gardener and a WWI soldier,
Oh, wow.
both spending decades at Hyroyd's.
Wow.
It just breaks your heart.
It makes you question who deserved care back then.
Right.
What constituted sane in a society that could discard people so easily.
Fast forward to 1948,
Okay.
a pivotal year, because that's when the National Health Service,
Yes.
or NHS as it's known, comes into play.
Yeah.
Suddenly, mental health institutions become part of this grand plan for a healthier Britain.
And with the NHS came this wave of optimism.
Okay.
They truly believed that they could treat mental illness just like a physical ailment.
Okay.
This led to all sorts of new treatments, some more successful than others, but
Right.
two in particular stand out: electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT,
Okay.
and insulin coma therapy.
This is where the documentary takes a dark turn. And honestly, it's hard to stomach some of it. They don't shy away from the realities of these treatments. The brutality of ECT without anesthetic. The patient's own words describing the horrors.
It's hard for us to imagine now, but at the time these treatments were considered revolutionary.
Yeah.
Remember, this was a time when the world was still reeling from a war and science seemed like the answer to everything. But as we know, progress isn't always pretty.
Yeah, the progress and some pretty terrifying side effects, it seems.
Right.
The documentary mentions that 44 people died from insulin coma therapy alone.
Yeah.
It makes you think about the ethics of it all, the desperation to find a cure, even if it meant pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable.
And speaking of pushing boundaries, the documentary also delves into the use of lobotomies.
Okay, lobotomies.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, the idea of someone cracking open your skull and messing with your brain to cure mental illness, it's the stuff of nightmares. And they actually did this to people.
It's a dark chapter in medical history, that's for sure. Imagine the thinking at the time. Let's remove parts of the brain to fix mental illness. It's a chilling reflection of how little was understood about the brain's complexity back then.
And it wasn't just a handful of cases. The documentary mentions that over 15,000 lobotomies were performed in Britain alone. Just let that sink in for a moment. 15,000 people.
The story of Maggie Chapman, which the documentary highlights, is particularly heartbreaking.
Right.
She underwent this experimental brain surgery at Hyroyd's to try and curb her violent outbursts.
Her testimony is one of the most powerful parts of the documentary.
Wow.
She describes the procedure, the feeling of her brain being burnt, and the devastating long-term effects it had on her life. Hearing her say, "GBH, grievous bodily harm, that's what they did to my brain," It just sends shivers down your spine.
Maggie's story and countless others like hers really forced a reckoning.
Yeah.
Thankfully, alongside these more extreme treatments, there was a growing movement advocating for a more humane approach to mental health care.
Right, because in the midst of all this, something really significant happens. The Mental Health Act of 1959
Right.
finally a sign that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change.
Absolutely. This act marked a turning point.
Oh,
A
yeah.
move away from that Victorian model of simply locking people away
Right.
and towards a more compassionate, community-based approach to care.
And it's interesting because this shift coincided with the introduction of new psychiatric medications
Right.
like chlorpromazine or Largactil, as it was known.
Yeah.
The documentary actually captures this sense of hope surrounding these drugs. There's this quote from a nurse who says, "It was quite exciting. We asked if student nurses were allowed to get involved." You can practically hear the optimism in her voice.
It was a time of great promise, but of course, as we know, the road to better mental health care wasn't without its bumps. While these new drugs offered some relief and were a step in the right direction, they weren't the miracle cure everyone had hoped for.
And often, with each step forward, there's a counter-reaction, a questioning of the status quo. This era saw the rise of a figure who truly challenged the very foundations of psychiatry. R.D. Laing.
Laing was a revolutionary thinker.
Right.
He challenged the very definition of madness, suggesting that what we perceive as mental illness could actually be a sane reaction to a mad world. Imagine that, flipping the script on its head.
It's like maybe the problem isn't the individual, but the society they're living in.
Right.
Laing really tapped into that, and his ideas really resonated with the growing anti-psychiatry movement. This wasn't just about questioning treatments. It was about questioning authority institutions, the whole shebang.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this questioning of authority extended to the very existence of asylums. This is where Enoch Powell enters the picture.
Yep.
His 1961 speech, in which he outlines a vision of closing asylums and providing care within communities, was absolutely groundbreaking.
He called for the elimination of these isolated, majestic, imperious institutions. Remember, this was a time when the idea of closing asylums was unheard of.
It was a radical idea.
Talk about a bold prediction. It seems like everyone was feeling revolutionary at this time.
His speech was incredibly influential, but as with many things, putting vision into practice proved more challenging.
And the documentary doesn't shy away from that. It shows how the process of closing asylums and actually implementing care in the community was fraught with challenges, to say the least.
Right. It was a slow process, often underfunded and poorly planned.
Yeah.
The story of Joan Tugwell, featured in the documentary, is a stark illustration of this. Released after 33 years in various institutions, she was basically left to navigate the outside world with very little support.
Right.
It's a heartbreaking example of the huge gap between vision and reality.
It makes you wonder what happens when society decides someone is no longer mad, but doesn't provide the necessary support for them to thrive in the sane world.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, this disconnect had very real consequences.
Yeah.
The documentary talks about how public opinion shifted after several high-profile crimes were committed by former asylum patients.
Right. The Finsbury Park stabbing in 1992, which they mention, is a prime example.
Yes.
It sparked a wave of fear and panic, and suddenly those who were once deemed fit to re-enter society were now seen as dangerous. It's like society took one step forward and then two steps back,
Yeah.
driven by fear and misunderstanding. It really highlights the need for nuance in these discussions because it's rarely black and white.
You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
The reality is asylums were incredibly complex places.
Right.
While often places of suffering and abuse, they also provided refuge for some who had absolutely nowhere else to go.
Right.
And that's the conversation that's often lost in all of this.
And the documentary does a good job of showing both sides. There are interviews with former patients who describe horrific conditions and mistreatment,
Right.
but also those who talk about the sense of community they found within those walls.
Right.
It makes you think, what does it say about society when even a flawed system like this is sometimes the best option available?
It's a sobering thought, but out of these complex legacies often come opportunities for progress. The closure of asylums, while messy and imperfect, sparked a movement for patient empowerment and a more nuanced understanding of mental health.
And we see that reflected in the shift toward care in the community.
Right.
The idea that people can live fuller lives with the right support system in place.
Right.
But as Joan Tugwell's story shows us,
Right.
the execution hasn't always lived up to the ideal.
Absolutely. Care in the community only works if the care part is adequately funded and implemented. And that requires ongoing advocacy challenging stigma
Right.
and a commitment to seeing the humanity in everyone, regardless of their mental health challenges.
So where do we go from here? What have we learned from this deep dive into the rise and fall of asylums? And what does it mean for how we approach mental health today?
For me, it all boils down to empathy. Asylums and their isolation and often inhumane treatment really stripped away people's humanity. It's only by truly listening to those who have lived through these experiences, both patients and staff, that we can learn from the past and build a more compassionate future.
The documentary does an incredible job of bringing those voices to the forefront. We see these individuals not as diagnoses, but as people with stories, skills,
Right.
and a deep desire for connection. It's something we all share, regardless of our mental health.
Exactly. And that's what I hope our listeners take away from this. We've come a long way in recognizing mental health as a critical component of overall well-being.
Right.
But there's still so much work to be done. We need to keep talking, keep challenging the stigma, and keep pushing for better care.
And that's where you come in. We want to hear from you. What resonated with you from this conversation? Have you had personal experiences with mental health care, either navigating the system yourself or supporting loved ones? Share your thoughts, your stories, your insights.
Because these conversations matter. The more we talk openly and honestly about mental health, the more we chip away at the stigma and create space for understanding, compassion, and meaningful change.
We've only scratched the surface today, and honestly, this is one of those topics that you could spend a lifetime unpacking. But if you're as fascinated by this as we are, I highly recommend checking out the British Online Archives website.
Right?
They have this incredible collection of records, from Bedlam Royal Hospital letters, patient accounts, staff journals. It's like taking a trip back in time.
You might be surprised by what you discover and the connections you make to the present.
Yeah.
Remember, history has a way of revealing uncomfortable truths, but it also offers invaluable lessons for building a more humane and understanding future.
So keep asking questions, keep learning, and most importantly, keep talking.
Mm-hmm.
Because everyone, and I mean everyone, deserves to feel seen, heard, and supported on their mental health journey. Until next time, take care.